How many fathers do you have? I have three. I have my biological father, who I'm going to talk about. I have the man who raised me. And I have the man who is currently grandfather to my children. All these are in my lineage. When I was growing up, I was a very timid child. I was always to be found in a little corner, reading a book, being quiet. I was never the kind of child who was out there playing with other kids, except for when I was forced to get out and go and play with other kids, at which time I would light up and I would really enjoy time with them. But most of the time, I would be in a corner reading. I met my father, my biological father, when I was 6 years old. What happened was my grandmother decreed that even though he was not married to my mother, he was married to someone else and he had his own children. And even though they could afford to educate me, he had the responsibility to make sure that I was educated. So the decree was that at least once a year, he must meet with me and he must take me shopping for books. In my grandmother's mind, it was school books, because in those days, 844, you had to be given a list of books that you must, sort of come with. So on or around January 6th every year, he would come over, pick me up, and we'd go to Textbook Center. I think it's on Kijabe Street. And we would buy all of the books that the school had said we must buy. And then after that, he would just let me buy whatever I want. So I was a wealthy child. I had all copies of Tintin. I had all copies of Asterix. I had all copies of Hardy Boys, Secret Seven, Famous Five. You name the books that kids read, I had all the copies. And if anyone follows Hardy Boys and Famous Five and so on, they have like hundreds of copies. By the time I was 10, I was reading Jeffrey Archer and Sidney Sheldon because I had finished everything that was age appropriate. By the time I was 12, I was reading How Europe Underdeveloped Africa because it was in the house and I had nothing else to read. In around that time, that was the first time I read Jomo Kenyatta's book, Facing Mount Kenya. I was a well-read child, and this man made sure I was well-read. But there was another side to him. After the 6th, after we have done the shopping for the books, I would have really enjoyed the time that we had had together because he was this really well-spoken, well-thought-out person who entertained my childish ideas and who enjoyed to listen to them and engage with me and debate with me about those ideas. So I craved that because other adults were not like that. And he was my dad, so I wanted time with him as well. I had my dad who brought me up, but there was this guy, and he was like me. My other dad was white, so he didn't look like me, and other children had informed me that he was not my dad. So this guy needed to be in my life, and I needed to have a relationship with him. He would make promises and say, I'm going to, say, Somalia, but I'll be back on the 10th. So the Sunday next, I will come and pick you up, and we will go and have fun together. On Sunday, I would put on my Sunday best, and I would refuse to go to church because he might come at any time. And I would wait. And at 10 p.m., they would be changing me out of my clothes while I was asleep because I had cried myself to sleep and I had refused to come out of my Sunday best. And then I would go to a call box a few days later, and I would dial his number. One of his kids would pick up the phone and say, "Oh, Dad, somebody's on the phone for you." And then he would pick and say, "Oh, yes, I couldn't because I didn't come," whatever it is. But on the Sunday, that Sunday, I will come. And again, They would be changing me out of my Sunday best in my sleep, having cried myself to sleep because he didn't come. This went on for 8 years. My entire primary school, this went on. Now, whenever I was in Nairobi, I would be waiting for him on a Sunday and he would not show up. When I was a teenager in high school, I rebelled. I decided I don't need him. I decided that it doesn't make sense to continue waiting. I decided that it doesn't make sense to want a relationship with a person who does not want a relationship with me. So forget it. I don't want to. So he would call my mom and want to know how I was, and I would refuse to get on the phone to talk to him. And that went on throughout my high school. Then I became an adult. I reached the age of majority, and I was supposed to go elsewhere per my mom's dreams, but I insisted that what I was going to do is that I was going to stay in Nairobi and I was going to find my way in Nairobi. So I came to Nairobi and started hustling, started figuring out life. I was here for about 3 years, and I was 23 then, when I got to have lunch with my biological father again. When we had lunch, I sat with him and I unloaded. It was in a Chinese restaurant that was on Loiter Street. And in the middle of the day, it wasn't busy, and we got to sit at a corner, and I unloaded. I told him everything that he had done to me. I cried in this restaurant and said, "You hurt me." And he listened. And after he had listened and he had sort of allowed me to go through the process, what then he did is that he told me about himself. He told me that he grew up in the 50s when Kenya was undergoing the emergency times. He told me about hunger and how they used to live in a hut, multiple families, and the kids would be all in one side sleeping, and how a child died of hunger right next to him. He told me about seeing conflict, seeing people being killed in those days as a child, and how that sort of molded him to become a peacemaker. He told me about how his career had sort of shaped up with him going and looking for conflict in different parts of the world, which is what he did for a living, and bringing communities together, ensuring that they talked, ensuring that they found peace. For 30 or something years, he held the South Sudanese peace process together. He was the face behind the face, and he just focused his life. At that point, I understood that he was never meant to be my biological father. He was never meant to be my father in the sense of being a father. What he was meant to be was my friend. And so we got into an agreement that we're going to be friends and that we'll be talking. And so we used to talk, quasi every 2 weeks, and we used to have lunch at least once a month. South Sudanese became a state, and he became the ambassador to South Sudan at that point. And we would have lunch and talk about public affairs. It was even more interesting that I somehow found my way into public service as well, and he was there as a guide. And we had just gotten into this fantastic rhythm. When I was 26, he had a car crash and he died. I was so angry. I was so mad. I had just found a relationship with this man who I had been waiting for all these years, and then he goes out and dies. I met his kids, and we're very close now. But at that time, I was filled even with resentment towards them because they had had him all these years and I didn't. And I wanted to know more because every time you sat with him, he would tell you about what life was like and why, in the larger scheme of things, that's his phrase, in the larger scheme of things, whatever it is that you're stressing about right now doesn't matter because you won't worry about it too much after 5 years. He was that kind of man. He was filled with wisdom, and he spoke slowly, so you had to listen and understand what he was saying. And now he was gone. At that time, I had started this company that was way ahead of its time. It was a technology company. And I had spent all of my savings trying to make it work. And I was broke. Things were not going well. So that year was actually kind of the hardest year of all of the years that I had been, I think, working. I couldn't even afford bus fare, so I used to walk everywhere. You call me to your office to have an appointment, and what I would do is that I would figure out how much time I would need from South Sea, where I was staying, to where your office is. Doesn't matter where it is, in Raraka, wherever. And I would calculate how much time I would need to walk there, and then I'd make the appointment with you so that I can walk to your office. And the tea that you would give me probably would be my breakfast. I did that for a year. I started running away from my landlord because rent was due and I hadn't been able to pay. So I would leave before 6 a.m., before the caretaker wakes up, and I would come back home after he has already gone home so that, nobody could, we couldn't meet and he couldn't ask me, Wapi, deposit sleep? So it was in these circumstances that one day I was asleep and somehow I had overslept. So, you're supposed to wake up at 6 before the caretaker wakes up, but on this particular day I had overslept. I was woken up at about 8 o'clock with a phone call. And this very brash woman on the phone says, "Hi, your name is Al?" I said, "Yeah, my name is Al. Come for your check at Sharia House, government trustees." I said, "Well, I hadn't done any work for the government, so I didn't understand why I was coming for a check. So I thought that she must have gotten the name wrong or the number wrong. So I said, "I haven't done any work for you." And she said, "No, you're so-and-so's daughter, right? You're so-and-so's son, right?" I said, "Yes." "Come for your check." And she hung up. So I called my brother, his son, and I said, "Hey, I just got a call from the government trustees saying that I must collect a check. Do you know anything about this?" And he says, "Oh, they called you. Okay, so it must be time," because he hadn't been called. So I went to the government trustees' office, and I made a line, and I didn't understand what all this was about. But a check in this time when I have been so broke, any check is absolutely welcome from anyone. So I went there, made a line, got to the front of the line, and they said, "Wapi ID?" Give them ID. They looked at my ID, they opened this big tome that they have, a big black book, looked for my name, said, "Sign here, sign here, sign here," picked a few other papers, "Sign here, sign here, sign here," and then gave me an envelope and said, "Bye." Just like that. So I walked out of Sharia House, and standing outside of Sharia House at Harambe Avenue, I opened the envelope and I saw a check of more than 1,000,000 shillings. You guy, more than 1,000,000 shillings. At a time when my diet had been half bread and milk taken on credit from the kiosk, at a time when I was still running away from the landlord, at a time when nothing was working, I had more than 1,000,000 shillings. At that time, that 1,000,000 shillings feels like 1,000,000,000 shillings. Suddenly, I was rich. I went, there was companies that could cash the check like immediately. I gave it to them, they gave it to me some cash. I went, paid my rent, and now as a confident sort of individual, paid my rent, went back home. Oh, I passed by Nakumat and shopped like crazy, went back home, blacked out. It was only until maybe 3 weeks later that I got time to reflect on this thing. And I realized that even in his death, my father had come through and saved me. Daudi Waithaka was my biological father. I never said that until he was dead. Thank you.